All right, wonderful. Andrea Adelson, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it for taking the time out of your busy schedule, I'm sure. So we usually start by having you just kind of give us a recap of, we always like to bring alums in and chat with the students. So first, how you kind of got to UF, what you did while you were here, and then just kind of walk us through your career trajectory to where you are today with ESPN.
Okay, well, it's an honor to speak to you guys, and always a great pleasure of mine to talk to University of Florida students. I'm a proud Gator grad. I grew up in South Florida. Actually, grew up a big Miami Hurricanes fan. So the thought of going to Florida out of high school wasn't one that was super appealing to me as someone who loved the Hurricanes, but obviously I knew I wanted to be a sports writer. I wanted to be a sports writer, I think, from the time I was in third grade. I just loved watching football games with my dad, and I loved to write. And I asked him one day, I think I was in elementary school, like, do you think I could be a sports writer? And he was like, well, yeah, of course, why not? Like, not knowing at that time there were not very many women who actually did this. But he encouraged me and he pushed me. And obviously Florida has such an outstanding journalism program. It only made sense for me to go to Florida. And I immediately made sure I went to the Alligator, and started to work on how exactly I would go about becoming a sports writer. And there were a lot of really fun times. If anybody watched the documentary on the Florida soccer team that aired on the SEC network last week, a couple of my clips from the Alligator made it there, because that was my first beat. That was like a cool moment for me to see my Florida soccer stories appearing on SEC network. But yeah, that was my first beat. And obviously, eventually I covered football. Steve Spurrier was the head coach, and a lot of great experiences covering him. And it was an awesome learning on the job, both in class at UF, but also with the Alligator, being able to write consistently for the student paper, but also being a correspondent for other papers across the state. And I know I probably sound like a dinosaur here because I'm talking about newspapers. That was the way to get your foot in the door back then, was to be a freelance correspondent for the Miami Herald or the Palm Beach Post, the St. Pete Times, newspapers like that. And so I was just, dead set. This is what I want to do, and I'm just going to do whatever I need to do to get to my dream job. And here I am. I graduated in 1999. Started working for ESPN in 2010. Along the way, I worked at the South Florida Sun Sentinel, the Associated Press, and the Orlando Sentinel. And now this is my 15th year covering college football for ESPN.
Thank you for that recap. That's really cool about seeing your clips on that documentary. That must have been a really fun time to be able to cover that team. Yes.
No, it was amazing. And, in the moment, right? I was, I think, 19 years old, really didn't know what I was doing. Like, let's be honest, I was trying to act like a professional, but I was still trying to figure out how to build relationships, how to build trust, how to ask questions. But the great thing about Becky Burley, who I've been able to reconnect with here over the last year, she was the coach at that time, and now she's got a position working in the Florida gym across the way, in the school there. She was very patient, and she also appreciated the coverage. I mean, it was myself and Mark Long, who works for the AP now and is based out of Gainesville. And it was the two of us showing up every day at practice, going to every single home game, and covering them like they were as important as the football team. And that was great for us to be able to get that experience as beat reporters, like my first year in college or my second year in college. It was their second season as a team, but they also appreciated the fact that we treated them like they were any other team on the campus. And so we were able to build really good relationships with Becky, and with the players on that team, that allowed us to have better coverage, we felt, of course, than the Gainesville Sun, because we had an opportunity to get to know these players on a far different level because we just showed up whenever we could, every day. And it was awesome. And yeah, I work for ESPN, and it's incredible and amazing. And my byline is up on ESPN.com, or sometimes I'll do something for television, and there I am. But Man, I just got really weepy when I saw my alligator story pop up on that SEC story because it mattered. It made a difference. And we were right there chronicling the rise of a program that won a national championship in 4 years. Truly, truly awesome and remarkable.
That's great. So you graduated at a time heading into the 2000s when there, was a lot of change starting to happen in journalism and sports journalism world, and it has evolved quite a bit over the last 20 to 25 years. What are some things that you have done to keep yourself current and remain at the top of your game and working for one of the biggest sports outlets in the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was at Florida, I know it's different now, thank goodness, but when I was at Florida, it was very much siloed. If you were a print major, you only did writing. You got no experience in front of a camera. You got no experience doing radio, like absolutely nothing. And so here I come to work for ESPN in 2010 when you're right, there was a huge shift to okay, forget about only writing, now become a multimedia reporter, now take video, now take photos, now go in front of a camera, now learn how to speak for television. And I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, let's be honest, I literally had no training beyond watching what people were doing on TV. And it was very rough at first because as you all know, as multimedia students, talking for TV and writing for TV is something completely different than writing for a digital publication or a newspaper, magazine, long form. And so having to learn that while being employed by ESPN, I essentially set out to talk to as many people as I possibly could so that I could learn how to do it. I knew it was important for me to be able to stay in the industry and stay in the business to learn to adapt to change to become different and not just to be set in whatever ways I learned at Florida, which still are incredibly valuable to me to this day. But I had to be different and I had to ask a lot of questions. I had to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I'm sure that's a phrase that you've heard somewhere along the way in your life, but it's hugely important when you're going outside what you feel good about to do something that's completely different. And it's taken a lot of time, a lot of years, a lot of constructive criticism, a lot of feedback, but just knowing and understanding that this is now part of my job. This is now who I am. And then you incorporate the social media aspect to this, figuring out how to brand yourself, how to market yourself, how to make a name for yourself, how to separate yourself in an industry where it becomes really hard to do. I'm still learning that part. That part, I still have to ask more questions about how do I do a better job of making sure I've got a solid social media presence so that people know who I am, but also can trust what I'm trying to do on a daily basis.
What's the hardest thing you've had to learn to do?
Ugh, um, man, that's a great question. Uh, the hardest thing has probably been figuring out how to be halfway decent on camera. And I'm not going to sit here and say I'm good by any stretch. I'm getting better with every opportunity that I get. And I've gotten a lot more opportunities. And the whole reason I've gotten a lot more opportunities is because every time I have the chance, I try and learn from the previous time that I was on TV. And so the more reps you get, the more comfortable you feel, the better you are. But, I've done a few more things for college game day over the last few years. Um, and interviewing for television, when you're sitting down in front of somebody with the cameras on you, is completely different than if you're interviewing somebody for a written piece. And that has been incredibly difficult to learn because when you're asking somebody questions on camera, you need them to tell you everything. If I'm writing a story, I can fill in the backstory with my own words, right? Or I can have maybe a little bit more of a conversation. But on television, you have to ask much shorter questions. And even though you know what may have happened last Saturday, you have to ask what happened last Saturday and then what happened and then what happened so they can tell you, give you all the details, the dates, the information, the key play. And even now, I did something on the BYU quarterback like a month ago, and I went back and I read through the transcript, and I was kicking myself because there were a few opportunities I missed by asking questions that were more geared for a written article as opposed to a television article, or a television piece. So that has, I think, probably been the hardest thing, is I've been asked to do more television. Going on camera is hard. It gets easier with more reps, but figuring out how to ask those right questions so you can get that perfect soundbite for television, that's really hard.
What kind of resources does ESPN make available to you to help you along in that process in improving, or do they?
Yeah, that's a great question. So because I'm kind of caught in the middle, I'm still a digital reporter who does some television. I don't have probably the same types of coaching as people who are in front of the camera do at all times. So what I've tried to do, quite honestly, is talk to the television producers that are assigned to the pieces that we do, so that I can ask them. And everyone has a different approach, but trying to get that perfect soundbite with the questions that you ask is an art form. That's why Tom Rinaldi is really good at his job. That's why there's only a handful of people who can do it on a consistent basis and have the type of respect across the industry that they have, because you're not only having to ask questions in a certain way, but you've also got to make the subject feel comfortable about talking to you and make them feel like they can be honest and raw and real with you. That takes a lot of work. And so I found that the producers that I've worked with have been incredibly helpful in terms of I'll come up with a list of questions. Here's what I'm thinking. And then at the very beginning, when I started to do this, they would completely rewrite the questions for television. And so once I kind of could see in front of me, I'm a very visual learner. Once I could see in front of me, this is what it should look like as opposed to this, then you start getting better at it and more consistent at it. And then, you go through with every single thing and you trade. This is what I'm thinking. This is what the producer is thinking. Those questions, so you can have at least a good idea when you sit down in front of the person. This is how I want the interview to go. This is how I want the questions to flow. And then afterwards, quite honestly, what I'll do is I'll go back to the producers who like oversee the features department, and I'll ask for very real and honest constructive criticism about what could I have done better, what could I have done differently, how can I continue to improve in these areas. So everybody that I've talked to has been super willing to help me get better at what I'm doing. And I think that has kind of helped give them the confidence to know they could come back to me whenever they need an important story to be told.
That's great. So obviously we know storytelling is kind of at the heart of the profession, regardless if you're on the video or print side of things. You hinted at it, I think maybe a little bit about building relationships and asking the right questions are key to storytelling. What's some other advice that you could give the students a little bit about telling strong and engaging stories?
Well, that's my goal with every single story that I'm reporting. And you're right. It's the same whether it's for digital, print, or TV. You want to be able to tell the most compelling story possible. You want to be able to build that trust with the people that you're talking to so that they can open up to you. And what I try and do, quite honestly, is once I've made the person that I'm talking to feel comfortable, is I ask as many questions as I possibly can, whether we're talking about like detail, right? If someone says, "Oh, I spoke to my mom." Well, what did you say? What exactly did you say? What was a part of that conversation? And then what did she say back? And what did you gain from that conversation? Let's say that's part of a story that I'm working on, a relationship with someone in a parent or a coach. I try and nail down as much as I can. What were you thinking? What were you feeling? What were you going through in that moment? What were you saying? Because that provides a much deeper picture beyond, yeah, my coach, called me and told me X, Y, and Z. All right, I want to know the full picture of that. And so as I've, gotten further on down the line in this profession, I've really tried to make sure that I'm getting as much detail as possible while also trying to make sure I'm building that relationship during the interview to get them to say what I feel can make the most compelling story. And I know a lot of times it's hard because you feel like, man, I might sound silly if I ask this like very basic question, but a lot of times those very basic questions end up yielding the best either anecdotes, quotes, sound bites. So you can't ever feel like nervous or shy about asking anything. I put everything on the table. That's what I tell myself. And if it sounds like, a dumb question, oh well, it isn't, because any question is a good question. And even though you might know the answer to it, well, you're not the subject of the story. The person you're talking to is the subject of the story. So you want to hear it from them. So you can kind of confirm, what you're thinking, what you want to write about, and how you want the story to go.
I'm gonna turn it over to the students, see if they have any questions. Anybody have any questions for Andrea? Go ahead, Jesse.
Simple, just what's the most enjoyable part about your writing once you have that final copy done and you had like this story, you feel it when you write it sometimes and you can feel the emotion. How does that feel when you do have that story and it does well and you can finally feel accomplished with it?
Man, that's a great question. So I just turned in a story on the new Tennessee women's basketball coach. And I got to go to Knoxville and interview her in person. I talked to a lot of people around her, and I had an idea of like what I wanted to write. Now, sometimes you have an idea of what you want to write, but then when you end up writing it, it's completely different maybe than what you thought it would be. I had an idea of what I wanted to say here. She's obviously taking over a program that used to be the best one in women's basketball with a legendary head coach, and they haven't had the same success since she left. She's somebody who doesn't have a lot of head coaching experience, has only coached 1 year on the Division I level. It's completely outside the box hire that Tennessee made. So I wanted to tell this story about this person who's completely unexpected now filling a job where the expectation is national championship or bust. And how is she going to do this? And how is she handling it? And oh, by the way, she's also got this like little statue of Pat Summitt, the legendary coach, sitting on her desk staring at her every day. Like how? And I asked her a lot of questions about that. Like, isn't that, why would you have that in front of you? That, to me, I'd be like really intimidated, but how do you feel about it? So anyways, I turned it in. I wrote 4,000 words. It's way too long. But when I turned the story in, I was just so happy because it was exactly what I wanted to do and how I set out to write it. I'm still waiting on an edit, so it's like a TBD on how happy I'll be once it gets published. But I feel like I gave it everything I possibly could. I mean, I labored over every word, every thought. How am I going to say this? How am I going to phrase it the right way so that I can convey the right feeling, emotion, message? And I was just really proud of the way that it turned out, because it tells a really good story, and I think gives people an understanding of why Tennessee did this and why she feels she's going to be successful in this job. So, there's no greater feeling than getting the access that you need, the interviews that you need, the subject being open and willing to talk to you about uncomfortable truths and situations, and then being able to put it all together into one total package, is the best feeling in the world. And it just reminds you, it literally reaffirmed to me, this is why I love what I do. This is why I'm still thrilled with this job 25 plus years later, because it gives you this opportunity to tell these incredible stories and be the person to be able to tell these incredible stories, so that when people tune in to Tennessee basketball, they know, oh yeah, I remember reading about her, and yeah, I know why Tennessee hired her. It was just very reaffirming, I think would be the right word.
Awesome. Shaylee?
So you mentioned with that particular story, you traveled to Knoxville and got to sit down with her in person and like have an interview that way. Obviously, like you've been with ESPN for a while, like pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. So, what does reporting look like for you now when it comes to actually being able to sit down in person with the subjects of your story and like getting to have that like personal connection with them versus online, like via Zoom interviews?
That's a great question, because it's a lot harder, quite honestly, to travel in person to be able to do these really in-depth feature profile type stories. I don't get to do that very often, which, is probably why it was reaffirming to me. I got this opportunity and I made the most of it. I would say 95% of the time, I am doing interviews either on the phone or via Zoom. So I have one coming out. I have two stories coming out next week. One of them is on a tight end at Bowling Green, who is the best tight end in the country right now. And I'm sure you guys are like, really? Someone at Bowling Green? Yeah, he is. How did he end up at Bowling Green? That's part of the story. That was a Zoom interview with him. And he had to deal with some, excuse me, some tragedy in his life. His sister passed away last year and she was his best friend. And so not being able to be there in person to do that, it's just a little bit harder when you have to do it over Zoom. I spoke to his mother. That was a phone interview. And that's the majority of what I have to do, even with some difficult or uncomfortable, stories that I have to report on. The second one is a cooler story. It's about, fans who are like so super passionate about their college sports teams that they will spread the ashes of like their loved ones or their friends at football fields. I saw someone do that years ago at the Tim Tebow statue right in front of the stadium. That's kind of what got the wheels turning about people do this. Yeah, a lot of people do this. And all of those interviews, I did more than 10, were over the phone. So unless I'm going to a game and, doing some reporting in person post game, the large majority of what I do is Zoom and phone. And that just makes it more challenging because you can't see the body language, you can't read the expression on somebody's face. And so it feels like a lot more effort on the phone and Zoom, although I guess you can look, at the body language on Zoom. I think it's still a little bit different. So I tend to ask more questions when I have to do it that way because I'm not there in person. And so I have to be able to have a much better feel for what they're thinking or feeling in that moment because I can't see it and I can't describe it for myself. And that's what I would say is get used to doing interviews over the phone. Like if you've got the type of job that I do now, if you're going to be a beat reporter, you'll do everything in person at all times. I'm, a conference / national person who at any time I could be assigned a story, anywhere from any school. And I obviously prefer to do those in person, but because we have the technology now, it's much harder to get those types of trips.
Riley, go ahead.
So when, as young reporters, we're kind of still trying to find our footing in how to approach different kind of stories, structure-wise, but in your experience, do you have a way of like, that you avoided, especially early on, like tripping over your feet, and really, do you have like a way of like approaching specific types of stories? Like if it's a personal story or just making sure you don't get too deep into the weeds?
That is an awesome question. Talk about getting too deep in the weeds. That's why I wrote 4,000 words and I turned it in and I was like, oh my gosh, I like wrote everything that was in my notebook. I hope they like it. I don't know if again, I haven't gotten the edit back yet, so I'm sure it's going to be cut. But that is a great question because that remains a work in progress. And there are going to be stories where you're going to look back and be like, I wish I had done it a different way, or I wish I had included more detail, or I wish I included this anecdote that I ended up leaving out. Being a journalist is part of like, you have to accept being imperfect, even though like I'm a perfectionist and our job is to get the story right. As long as the facts are right, that's great. But telling the story, you could tell it in 1,000 different ways, and all those 1,000 different ways could be the right way to tell it, right? And so that's why I feel like so much of what we do is an imperfect science and based on what we're feeling in that moment, the information that we have, the best way to tell the story, the platform that story is being told on. All of that to me plays into how am I going to tell the story? How am I going to structure a story? And especially if we're talking about television versus digital, there's a far different way to tell a story on TV, because you've got about 3.5 to 4 minutes to do it, as opposed to if you've got the 3,000 words to be able to get into a lot more detail or specifics. And so, let's say I'll just use this Tennessee story since I just wrote it. What I tried to do was come up with an outline. This is what I want the lead to say that's going to give people a glimpse into what the entire story is going to be about. Then how do I want to structure it? Do I want to get to the most important thing that I want to say? Do I want to kind of tease that, give a little bit more background information before I get into it? And then kind of how do I want it to end? And the way I like stories to end is I try and circle back to the beginning. And so the beginning of this story, talks about the fact that, she came to take this monumental opportunity. But in her very first head coaching job at Glenville State, which is Division II in this tiny town in West Virginia, she journaled, and she took a Pat Summitt quote and wrote it on the front cover of the journal in 2016. And now here she is, in Pat Summitt's office, literally using the same office, as the head coach at Tennessee. And so I felt like that was a really good entry. I could have written so many different things. I mean, I watched 2 practices. I could have described the practice and the things that they're doing. I thought about, quite honestly, the first thing I wrote, the first thing I noticed at practice, they were in the arena, and directly above her was the banner, commemorating what Pat Summitt had done at Tennessee. So I'm like, well, I was there. I should use a visual from actually being there at the practice. So again, it could have been good that way. I just decided, all right, I want this to be like a Tennessee Pat Summitt, has to be included in here. So that's what I went with. And then at the very end of the story, I came back to that little Pat Summitt statue sitting on the desk, to try and make it, all right, she's got this journal in her desk. She had these words from Pat Summitt, and now she's got this little statue sitting on her desk. And then the rest of the story, I kind of told, well, how did she get here? And why did she get here? And what is she going to do to get back to a Final Four? So that I had it structured in a way that kind of made sense. It took me 3 days, quite honestly, to sift through all the quotes, to put them in the order that I wanted, then to read through the quotes again, then to come up with a lead. And that took probably half a day, more than that, because I wanted it to be perfect. And then, it gets easier from there. And I changed the ending 3 different times. So I don't know if that was helpful at all, but, I think once you come out of it, the interviews, and you kind of have an idea, this is what stood out to me. And honestly, some of the best stuff that I try and do is once the interviews are done, I'll write down what were the things that I remembered the most, right? Instead of having to go back and okay, because the things that you remember the most after a half-hour interview, that's going to be what you want the readers to know because it stuck with you and you remembered it, right? So you want to make sure that you highlight some of that so that when you go back, you're looking for that specific, moment or thought. And for sure, include that in the story. Game stories are a little bit different because you don't want to give the rehash of the play-by-play because people have seen the game. So you want to be able to focus on a key moment in time. Maybe if a coach is particularly animated after the game, you want to focus on that and why perhaps they were so animated. Give a backstory of the season, right? Every single game story is another chapter in a book that's being written right in front of your eyes. Use your context, your perspective, having covered a team, been around a team, knowing the coach, knowing the players, to add all of those little chocolate chips, I would say, throughout whatever cookie you're trying to cook every single day after a game, so that people understand the context. That's what makes the best game stories, not who all the play-by-play, but why did this happen in this particular moment and what does it mean for the team?
That's great insight. Jesse, another question?
Yeah, just kind of going off that, the flip side, interviewing people, some people can be very welcoming and warming to you, when you sit down with them about a story, and others are very closed off. just personal curiosity, what are some tactics you use to find common ground, to connect with those people, to make them open up, to get the things that you need for that story?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's hard. And quite honestly, there are some interviews where the person just simply won't open up, no matter how hard you try. Particularly when you're doing an extremely difficult interview on an uncomfortable topic. Let's say, okay, I'll use Billy Napier as this example. Everybody knows what his situation was going into the year, right? It's no secret. Well, my bosses were like, hey, you live in Orlando, you went to Florida. Why don't you drive up to Gainesville and see if Billy will sit down with you and like give you some time? And I was like, all right, well, I know what I got to ask him. I ask him these really hard questions about like, okay, like what have you done? It's year 3 now and everyone knows you're on the hot seat. And what are you going to do to get this team to win this year? And do you feel like you're on the hot seat? And how do you respond to criticism? And why do you feel like things are headed in the right direction when like nothing the first 2 years have indicated that? Like really hard questions. I can't just tiptoe around it. But Billy's a nice guy. And so he knew what I wanted to ask. But I also knew that I had to try and like make it feel a little bit more comfortable than just walking in there and just immediately hitting him with all of these like really hard questions. And so I talked about being a student at Florida. I talked about sitting in Steve Spurrier's office back in the stadium, essentially having no permission to go in there, but I needed him for a story and I just walked up there and he opened the door. That would never happen now. But back then it was, it was okay. So, I tried to, talk to him about things or my own experiences and what it was like for me to go to school at Florida and understanding the Florida fan base and what the expectations are. And I quite honestly, I feel like that helped a little bit in getting him to talk maybe a little bit more in depth about what he was facing this year than in some other interviews. But there's other instances, Mike Norvell this year, for example. Gosh, they're going through a really horrific season. And I've got a really good interview with Mike Norvell. But even though he knows me, and we've had a lot of great conversations, the last time I talked to him, it was 6 minutes of not a lot of in-depth answers. And there's no way to like make that comfortable. And you just have to know that and accept that too, like going in. This is going to be really hard. And I have to ask these really hard questions and they might not feel completely comfortable with it. That's okay. You still have to ask the question, even though it's going to be uncomfortable for the both of you. That's your job, is to go in there and ask what has to be asked. So just be aware of that. It's not always going to feel great and they're not always going to open up to you. And in those situations, you just have to accept that and not beat yourself up over it too much, as long as you did what you had to do and ask the questions that had to be asked.
So taking a little bit of a step back from what you just answered, I think a lot of our student journalists struggle with access a lot of times. And I know working at ESPN, access is, it's not as big as an issue, but it still can be an issue. And I'm sure you've dealt with it at different points in your career. What are some, what's some advice that you can give our young journalists and broadcasters here when they're struggling with access, of a way to approach a situation that may make an organization a little bit more comfortable with you coming in and asking some of those tougher questions?
Yeah. That is a very difficult question, because you're right. Access for someone who works at ESPN is probably a little bit easier. And I acknowledge that. And I understand that, I can get Mike Norvell on the phone, or I can get a sit down with Billy Napier in his office. It's probably not happening for a lot of other people. So I know that I'm in a special and unique position, but in the times where I don't have that access, or I'm told, no, like we're not going to make that person available. And this has happened a lot with athletic directors, for example, for stories that I've tried to work on, particularly with what's happened in the ACC and the issues that conference is going through right now, with 2 schools suing them and, being very clearly behind where the SEC and the Big Ten are. So what I try and do is make sure that I have contacts outside the people that I need to talk to. Because you know that there's oftentimes you're not going to go directly to the source. All right, Billy Napier is not going to like call me up and be like, yeah, I just got fired, right? For example. So how do you go around trying to figure out, well, who's going to tell me? Who's going to tell me that? Is it going to be Scott Strickland? Is it going to be someone inside the administration? Is it going to be an agent? Is it going to be somebody who is best friends with Billy? That's just like one example. Another example is if you want to do a profile on somebody, let's just say, maybe it's not a hard interview, but Florida's like, you know what, we're not going to make DJ Lagway available to you for a one-on-one interview. You'll get him in the group setting, but I gotta write the story on DJ Lagway. Who can you call? Think about who you can call. Who can you talk to? I spoke to his high school coach earlier this year and wrote a story just from the high school coach's perspective about what the recruiting process was like, what he was like in high school. There's other people who grew up with him, that you could probably reach out to and talk to. So you've got to kind of think of ways outside of going directly to the sources to be able to try and build up your own source base so that you have, other people that you can talk to for a story, because this is not just going to come up now. This is going to be a recurring and repeating, trend. Parents of players are always really good, sources of information. I always try and talk to parents if I'm doing like a profile of somebody. But definitely, people inside an athletic administration, whether it's the sport administrator, get to know them. Like if you're covering soccer, who's the sport admin there? You'll see them out at practice, talk to them, strike up a conversation, get to know them. You never know where that person may end up somewhere, down the line in your career. And that's what I always try and remind myself too, is the people that you're covering right now, whether they're admins, coaches, players, you may encounter them somewhere else. And that may end up leading to a greater story somewhere down the line because of a relationship that you built while you were a student at Florida.
That's great advice. All right, so we'll wrap it up here. One final question. So the students that are in this class are either graduating in December or April and heading out into the job market or grad school, whatever it may be. What's some parting words of advice as they kind of head off into their next adventure from your side of things? Obviously, your focus is more kind of on the journalism side of things, but what's some advice you can give them as they head into the next step of their careers?
That's also a great question. I would say be open to any opportunity that comes your way. I would say don't be someone who's like, well, I have to have a job doing X. All right, look at what opportunities are out there. There might be something that's appealing or worthwhile to you that you didn't know was available or you didn't know was an option for you until you started searching and doing your due diligence in what's out there and what could I possibly do, whether that is, on the side of it where I am, whether that is maybe working for a team, whether that is doing some social media work with organizations, whether that's, covering high schools, whether that's being a team reporter for a team website. Whether that's data, our ESPN stats and information group, I couldn't do my job without them. And if you love data, if you love math, there's jobs like that available to you where you can stay in sports and do something that's right in your wheelhouse. So I would say don't limit yourself, and keep growing, keep learning, keep reading, keep watching. Take notes when you've read something you really like. What did you like about it? How can that help you incorporate into what you want to do? If you loved a social media presentation, which I take notes on those because I'm not good at social media. If you loved the way someone did a TikTok or put something on Instagram with a reel or how they're presenting themselves on X, what do you love about it? How can you incorporate that into what you're doing? Build your brand. Make sure you're marketing yourself. A lot of times, wherever you go, the organization is going to be maybe worried on marketing what the players or coaches are doing. Well, you got to market yourself so that you are going to be valuable for someone in that next job and the next one and the one after that. So make sure you're doing that. Don't be shy about doing that. I still am, because that's not how I grew up. And I've got to be better at that. So I would say taking notes, learning, watching, getting better, getting outside your comfort zone, as I mentioned, and never limiting yourself. Those are, I think, like good, words to live by for anyone.
Andrea Adelson, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. Have a great rest of your day and rest of your week as well.
Thank you.
And guys, okay, like your professor has my email address. I'm always available, and you can find me on social. You can DM me. If you have any other questions, if you want me to look at anything, I'm really happy to do it. So please don't be shy about that.
We appreciate that.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Have a great rest of your day, guys.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.